Welcome to Your Brand Amplified, the podcast where we interview marketers, publicists, and brands to learn their stories, what makes them tick, and tips and tricks that make a difference. I'm so excited to have TJ Bonaventura here today, who is the founder of StudioPodMedia. And we're going to be talking about podcasting, but in a slightly different way and much more in depth than a lot of my previous guests have. So TJ, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
Hey, so let's talk about your company because you were doing something a little bit different before, but tech related. What were you doing and what brought you into the world of podcasting?
Yeah. So previously, I was born and raised in the Bay Area, so Silicon Valley. And as most that are from that area tend to do, they find their way in tech and in SaaS. I was there throughout as a child through the dot-com boom and saw a lot of our family get involved in tech. And then when I finished college, inevitably got roped into being on Hamilton Road in Palo Alto and working in an incubator. And I just loved the life and the style of which work was being developed and how it was changing with the Googles and the Apples and these large organizations. And you saw it trickle down to startups. And I loved working for startups. And so I found myself working in tech for almost 10 years. Before then, I got into podcasting. And the podcast story is kind of funny because I never saw myself doing this as ways to live or making ends meet. I tried to start a podcast with a friend of mine. At the time, I was living in New York and he was in San Francisco and tried to do what we're doing right now, trying to record remotely and figure out a way to produce it. And I realized it is really hard. This is something really difficult. And this was late 2017, early 2018. And eventually I kind of planted the seed of there needs to be a production company out there that is helping both individuals and organizations develop a podcast and not just like the editing, everything from the concept to the production to the distribution. And that was kind of the start of StudioPod. And soon after that, opened a studio in San Francisco and now we're fully remote and have 5 years under our belts working with organizations.
Amazing. Do you work with specific types of podcast businesses or people who want to start podcasts?
Yeah, great questions. We're exclusively working with organizations who want to use podcasting as part of their overall marketing strategy, whether it's brand awareness, driving leads, what have you. We tend to lean a little bit more on the B2B side, just because that's my background, working for tech and being a solution consultant, which is a fancy word for just a demo jockey for salespeople and selling marketing software. It's just the world that I knew and know. And so we tend to lean more in that direction, which is a much more fun conversation for me, at least, than working with individuals who are trying to become, let's say, like the next Joe Rogan.
Right.
It's a little bit more creative.
Yeah. Very different type of podcast for sure. So you started this journey when podcasting existed, but a lot of people still weren't even listening to them or didn't realize what you could do with a podcast. So when you were talking to prospective clients about podcasting and why they should incorporate it as part of their strategy, did you find barriers? Did you find it was pretty easy because it was B2B? Like, what was that journey look like?
Yeah, definitely barriers. We were definitely ahead of the game in 2017, 2018, even 2019 with talking to organizations. Some got it, but at the end of the day, the budget just wasn't there. And even today, it's still very much like, what is the ROI on this? Which, the trends are changing positively in our direction. However, there were a ton of barriers of like, why would I do this? How much time is it going to dedicate? I can just do it myself. I'll give it to somebody on our team who can just edit it. I just need a mic and I can talk to my co-founder. And a lot of that was like, okay, good luck. Like, let us know. And I wouldn't say this to them overtly, but it'd be like, I'll talk to you in 12 months when you're ready to actually have a real conversation. And thankfully for us, and it was one of those industries and one of these content strategies that was a bit pandemic proof. The pandemic brought a lot of pain to a lot of people and a lot of jobs were lost and a lot of things that we all are very aware of that happened. However, for us, it banded together communication in a way that had never happened before, one of which was creating content remotely. Previous to the pandemic, many budding podcasters thought that they had to be in a studio, right? And then they need to build one or they needed to go somewhere to get high quality audio. Through the pandemic, that narrative changed a bit where we could be remotely like we are right now and be able to capture high quality audio. And the audience really cares the most about content versus the quality. While quality still matters, it really matters what you're trying to put out there. So after the pandemic, we started to see a little bit of boom in the business and more companies being like, this is something we need to do. How do we do it? We can't do it ourselves. We're taking too much away from other businesses or the other part of the businesses, And then that's when they would come and work with an agency like ours.
Yeah, I just actually finished giving a talk right before this about go-to-market strategies for branding for businesses and going through all of that. And the point really was, you might know these concepts, you might know that you can do it yourself, but if that's not your zone of excellence, why would you? Stick in your zone of excellence for your business. Let somebody else do that work for you so that you can grow your business by focusing on what you do best.
Yeah, exactly. Again, part of it was just a nascent industry and nascent content strategy at the time. And for a lot of parts, it still is now. However, we are still starting to see a lot more organizations say, we need to be doing a podcast. We don't know where to start. We're seeing a lot of startups get involved, say, we need to do a podcast. We don't know where to start. And then it's more about like budgetary constraint and parameters of what it is that they actually want to do. And plus, we're seeing a lot more peers in the space, which is great. Like obviously, it's always good being a big fish in a small pond, but I want to see other companies out there doing what we're doing because it's proving the value of this strategy in this medium overall. So it is something that is coming up more and more. And I'm having a lot more conversations every week than I did, let's say 2 years ago. But now it's more of like, okay, we need to do this. How do we do it within the constraints of our budget?
Right. Yeah. And we were talking a little bit before we hopped on because I hosted podcasts for a couple of clients and they had budget constraints. You don't have enough money to market this, much less I wasn't really paying myself. I was just paying people for the production to get them done because I really believed in the missions of these clients. But at some point we had to just say, look, you're not going to get the ROI and the brand value you want out of it with the amount of investment that you're putting into it. So I'd love to hear what you're seeing on your side as some of the trends. I mean, even for my own podcast, it came out of, well, they're not going to continue, so I'm just going to do my own. And I changed my narrative, which I know you also work on the branding and the storytelling and what the podcast is going to be for your clients, right? I mean, you do the whole package. Like you said, you're not just a production company. But I think those things are really important. And when I was doing mine, I definitely changed the format of mine. I changed how many times I release it. I had to play with some things to figure out what worked for me and for my brand and for my company and bandwidth.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the trends and what's going on, there's no one size fits all. And that's just the model that we decided to go with. I have had the experience of working with agencies in the past, and it felt like there was a lot of rigidity in that experience that I had. And there's a lot of rigidity in the space today. I have calls with clients all the time, and they're like, oh yeah, we talked to this other firm and this is what they do, and they don't have flexibility. And I'm like, that is not what I wanted to do when I created this. So keep that in mind when I walk through here. So we always try to come up with a model that makes sense for the client, whether you're a 10-person startup with $10 million in funding, or you're a financial behemoth who has infinite amount of budget for this. So when we look at trends, there's a couple of things that pop up. One, this is not only an audio medium anymore. When I think of podcasting, it is not singularly and only audio that is going to be discovered and distributed on Spotify, Apple, and all the podcast players. This needs to be a video also play. And I would highly recommend anybody who's thinking about doing a podcast or is doing one to start to think about video and how they can leverage that medium within the story that they're trying to tell. And the reason why I say that kind of leads into the other trend of distribution. Because we are long past the days of you could put up a podcast and you're going to get, hundreds of thousands of followers a month and become a top 10 podcast. That's just not going to happen anymore, no matter what you're doing, unless you have millions of followers on Instagram and you're a celebrity or you already have some sort of following. It is going to be very difficult to solely get downloads, which is the only metric that Apple and Spotify give you. And so where we tend to lean is the distribution. So how can we take a 30 to 40 minute podcast and stretch that into anywhere from 6 to 8 pieces of content from that one podcast that then we can repurpose, let's say 6 to 8 to 12 months down the line. So those are the big trends. And, we tend to do with our clients is come up with a model that makes sense. Maybe you don't need to have 8 pieces of content, but maybe you want to do 2. And maybe you only want to do 2 because you're releasing every week. But maybe if you're doing once every month, you want to have 12 pieces of content. So there's a lot of levers that can be pulled, and you want to be able to distribute the content where your audience is ultimately going to live. So if it's going to be a B2B organization, it's probably going to be on LinkedIn is going to be your go-to spot, or YouTube, or even TikTok. Now we're seeing a lot of our clients get a lot more involved on that medium because they want to leverage the algorithm. Not to say that it's the best one, but there's a lot of differing opinions right now with TikTok. But, that's kind of the methodology that we tend to come up with. And again, it's going to be different with every client.
Yeah, but to that point, if you are trying to attract businesses that are run by younger millennials or Gen Z, their search is TikTok. It's not Google and YouTube. And if it is Google, well, now Google is incorporating podcasts and TikTok videos into their algorithm for search so they can capture that audience too. On the PR side of things, a trend that I'm seeing a lot of people talk about is really going heavy into podcasting. I think survey I just saw said 38% of publicists are using podcasting as part of their strategy. And I also saw that a lot of companies, a PR talk I just recently attended, were saying that they are starting podcasts for their businesses and their brands because they're now seeing, oh yeah, this is not just some bandwagon or some fly-by-night thing. Podcasting is replacing audiobooks. There are so many reasons to make podcasting part of your strategy and part of your business strategy. Not to mention all the content that you said, people can get out of it. So that creates things for you to use on your owned media, on your social media.
Exactly. And I think that's been a nice shift across the board because from a PR standpoint, it used to be, and you'll know that I will, is like, how do we get all of our executives on as many podcasts as possible to tell the story of the business and ourselves? Now there's a large shift in, okay, now we want to tell the story about our business. And we don't need to do it in a way that needs to be a once a month, once every week, once every 2 weeks. We've had some really awesome success stories of organizations who want to do just a very short 12 episode series of just why they're doing what they're doing in their business or telling the story of how it got started. It's very popular on the B2C side too, as well, because you start to build an alliance with your audience to understand or help them understand like why you exist and what you're doing and telling stories. And if you do it right, that 10 or 8 or 12 episode series can be something that you can reuse and repurpose 2 to 3 years down the line. So that's another shift too. I think we often get conditioned as podcast consumers because we listen to our favorite podcast every week. I have mine that I listen to every Sunday night or every Monday morning or whatever. That brands, if we have to do the same, which is no, absolutely not. Like I would argue that if you're trying to do that, then you're going to exhaust not only the story, the content, and you're just going to create content that's going to be eventually lazy narrative. And I would deter anybody from doing that unless they have the right team and they have the story and content in place of what they want to do.
That's a really interesting point. Because I know something else I read recently said of the millions of podcasts on Apple, only about 18% are active. So only about 18% have had an episode released in the last 90 days. But to your point, is that really important? Yeah, it really depends on who you're trying to reach and what your goals are with the podcast. So if you're thinking about it that way and taking that approach, which really is like looking at your podcast as a brand and using all the brand building tools to develop it and create your messaging and marketing and all of that strategy. Yeah, I like that. That's a little bit of a shift. And the way I usually present it, like when I'm talking to my students at USC about podcasting or something.
Yeah, I think the thing that we need to remember is that this is a really still very much a creative medium that a lot of things can be done with it. And it's only, we're still only in like the bottom of the third inning here of what's going to be done with podcasting. There's so many awesome trends that are happening. One with the distribution, like the idea of, okay, we are going to just create one episode a month and we're going to create a crap load of content that we can reuse and repurpose down the line that makes our content team, makes their lives much, much easier down the road. And then we're going to partner with a software platform that allows us to reuse it easily. Like there's so many things that you can be done. And then the other thing that's really cool is that we're seeing a lot of organizations use that feed as just another stream to support content. So when you're creating a new podcast feed, whether it's going to be on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or whatever, similar to what you would do in YouTube in the past, like why are we only going to have one channel on there discussing one topic? Why not present a lot of different points of views around what the business is doing? And we're starting to see the same thing in audio. Within podcasting. So if you imagine going to a Spotify feed, you're not just going to get one type of podcast, you're going to get a lot of different types. So if an organization uses that as an own channel, then you're going to get a lot of interesting content. And then, with the power of changing cover art and having different writers and letting the audience know what they're about to listen to, there's a lot of interesting creative opportunity there that I think has not been tapped, but some organizations are starting to see that value.
Oh, it's really interesting. So you did have a physical location, you said, pre-pandemic. I'm assuming that helped shift your business. Was it already starting to shift towards being more remote?
Well, if I'm being honest, I always wanted to have a remote organization.
Okay.
I knew that's what I wanted to do. But when we first started, I wanted to have a physical location because I just felt like there weren't enough podcast specific studios out there. A lot of them were very stuffy and they weren't really eclectic and they didn't offer a lot of room for creativity. And that was the opposite of what we've done. So if anybody goes and checks out our site or has been to the studio in the Mission in San Francisco, we have fun painted walls, we have a beer cart, we have a bar cart. are. We have multiple couches and situations where people can record in lots of different settings. But then when the pandemic came along, I knew I wanted to keep the studio and I wanted to give that as an offering for anybody who was in the Bay Area and who was available to record there. But I didn't want that to be like my barrier of scale to grow the business. And so in 2021, I started laying the ground roads of being remote. And then in 2022, I moved to Mexico City and have been fully remote myself, and our team has been since. And we still have somebody who runs the studio, but it's been one of the better decisions that I've ever done, because now I can work with companies in New York or in Nashville or in Seattle or wherever.
Nice. So what are some of the misconceptions that you hear when businesses are thinking about starting a podcast?
Downloads matter. Yeah, no, it's a big one. Like downloads matter. There's no way to measure ROI are the two biggest ones. And at the end of the day, both of those are false. Apple and Spotify do not give you enough data to understand who is listening and how long they're listening for. And you can't have measurable data there. So it's a bit tough from a perspective of, I care about the most amount of downloads, plus you're competing with 4 million other podcasts out there, and the discoverability on those platforms are really, really tough.
Yeah.
So if someone's like, for us, if an organization goes, we want to have 3,000 downloads, or they give me a number of downloads they want to hit, that's a bit of a red flag, because you need to put real spend and ad dollars behind it to get the visibility and discoverability to get those numbers. And that makes your ROI even tougher, because you can't tie the connection of, okay, if I know that TJ listened to this podcast, how do I know he's going back to our site and either requesting a demo or requesting information or purchases our platform or services?
Right.
When it comes to the ROI question, it definitely can be measured. You just have to be really thoughtful with it. One, you need to have the infrastructure in place, whether you're using a tool like Casted, which is a software program that allows you to see firmographic data around who is listening and for how long and the cadence of which they're listening to. And they can tie that back in with some interesting technology on their part, or the distribution model that we talked about. So if you're going to go and release each episode on YouTube, or maybe a quick 5-minute clip from a 30-minute episode on LinkedIn, how many views are you getting? How many impressions are you getting? How much engagement are you getting? Those are things that tie ROI. And then if you're able to have, let's say, not a gated form, but you have a form that says when somebody requests a demo or information about your services and how did you hear about this, and they put in podcast, now you have some more real attribution that gives you a bit of ROI. So it's all possible. And those are just like concepts of what can be done. But those are the two biggest barriers that we see. And then the other one, of course, is that we can just do it ourselves. And I can promise you, unless you have a team of 3 or 4 people dedicated to it almost solely, you know this, like it's going to be very hard to produce this on the long term.
Exactly.
You're not going to see the results in 6 months. This is a 12 to 24 month investment for sure.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've heard it, one number thrown out that's a sweet spot number is 100 episodes. And I will say that was when I was getting more traction with mine, but where I started to see an uptick. But it's also because I was being more consistent. So it had a lot more to do with me deciding I'm really going to put more time and money into this podcasting thing than just the fact that I had 100 episodes.
Yeah, and I think the 100 episodes is very good if you are an individual like yourself representing your own brand. Right.
Yeah.
Like that is a very good number, because I think part of why, and I've heard that number too, and I've suggested that number to clients as well, or just consulting clients. The reason why that number is good, because it shows if you have the fortitude to continue to do it for 100 episodes. If you think about 100 episodes, that's almost, you do it every week, that's 2 years worth of content.
Right.
If you're doing it every week, like that's a lot of time. And there's a lot of success stories out there of people who have gotten a lot of downloads or business from doing it much shorter. But, sometimes it takes a lot of effort and thought and creativity to get yourself and the podcast out there versus, just plainly just putting out there and hoping for the best. Like there's a lot of strategy that goes behind it, as you well know.
Yeah. I don't know if you would be comfortable sharing, but I'd love to hear like a success story and then a story where somebody just really missed the boat, didn't really understand, what went into it. And maybe you had to gently say goodbye to them as a client.
Firing clients sometimes can be the best thing. It kind of gives a lot of headache. So let me start with, I won't name specific names, but what has happened is the unrealistic expectation of clients. And a lot of this happened right in like early 2021 when things were starting to pick up. And there was not a lot of realization from brands and organizations of what it takes to start a podcast. And so there's been a handful of stories where we had a client or clients who wanted to do a podcast and they didn't know how long it took just to plan and develop it.
Yeah.
They thought that they could just go record and they would get the traction that they wanted. They didn't put a lot of effort and time behind it. There wasn't like a point of contact that we could connect with. So a lot of it was on our shoulders. And eventually the podcast failed. Like we got through all the episodes that we needed to do, but they never saw the results that they intended because they didn't either put it on their resources page or the hosts weren't resharing it on their distribution channels or the clients weren't putting on their distribution channels. But because they had put so much time and effort, they felt like they had already given what they needed to give to it. And so they had very short-sighted with their goals and expected like huge returns. So that's one that I think has happened a couple times. And lately we have doing this for 5 years, which in the podcast space, especially with organizations, is quite a long time. We've been able to recognize and be very upfront with expectations, both in what should be required out of the client, what they need, time that they need to dedicate, and also just like what are like basic KPIs that we should be shooting for and benchmarks and being realistic. And if this is something that they don't want to put long-term investment into, then we're probably not the right partner because, we are a premium solution, right? We have different offerings for everybody, but like we're still a premium solution compared to, finding somebody on Upwork who can just edit your shows. Some successes are just that the opposite. We've been very fortunate to work with some awesome organizations like Qualtrics and Morgan Stanley, Pinterest, these organizations, they all have one thing in common. Not that they're massive, but they have the patience to see this through. With Morgan Stanley specifically, in the first year, we didn't even get a podcast release until the 9th or 10th month of production. Part of that is because there's a lot of legality that goes behind that, but also they wanted to put out something that was like thoughtful, and they knew that if they built the bedrock or the groundwork, it was going to be something that we could have going on 5 years from now. Same thing with Qualtrics, same thing with a lot of our organizations. But that's not to say like we've had some smaller organizations to have a lot of success in leveraging the podcast, anecdotal success too. That's the other thing that we can't dismiss is like, what are people saying about it? Like, what is the real sentiment being captured on YouTube, on email, from clients, from prospects, all of that. So the one thing that is in common with all of those is that they have the patience and they want to dedicate at least 12 months of resources, not just monetarily, but like their time to putting something together that's going to be thoughtful, that they could reuse, as I mentioned for the fourth time, like reuse down the road, because that is a big part of this. Like we want to make the lives of content marketers that much easier.
Yeah. I love that you're talking about this. This is the same thing I preach to people all the time, is whether you're starting a business or an offshoot of your business or a podcast or whatever you're doing, put that time and intentionality up front. You want to build a stronger foundation and take the time to make sure you're reaching the right audience. You know who you are, your brand identity, your mission, vision, values, your positioning, all of that stuff. Because if you do it at the beginning, you can always shift it, but you're going to be in such a better place to have that longevity and that continuity than if you have been running your business and then you backtrack and you realize that you're not where you thought you should be, or you're reaching the wrong audience and your competitors are having better results with their podcast or what have you.
Yeah, the mission and values is a really important part of it too, because if you're just doing this just to do it because your peers are doing it, I don't know if that's enough of a reason to do it. Obviously, I believe in the medium and I think there's a lot that could be done here, but there is something really to be said of like someone who wants to do this because they want to tell a story and they want to do it in a creative way. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the easiest way to create a podcast is just doing an interview style, what we're doing here, but with a little bit more thought, effort, and putting it in alignment with what the mission of the business is, there's really cool creative ways to make this a unique podcast. There's a term that we like to follow called niches make riches, right? Like, we don't need to have the largest podcast in the world. What we want to do is create a very niche podcast to our audience because we're going to provide value. Because if that leads to one prospect moving down the marketing or sales funnel, that leads to, who knows, maybe 250K of pipeline accelerated, or maybe it leads to 50K of closed business, or it retains your largest client, or it gets shared across in a community. Like these are things that matter to the business when they want to start something like this. It isn't just like as simple as a blog. I think we all saw that with blogs, right? Like everyone's doing a blog, so we got to do it. And that's when you get the kind of standard, not so creative, what are the 10 things that you need to be thinking about? Because that's the easiest type of content to put out there. Like, It's much harder to do an investigative type of show or piece. And it's the same with podcasting. If you put a little bit of thought into what the outro is going to be, why are we going to have this guest on? Like, that's another question that we always ask. Okay, cool. Why do you want to have this guest on? Oh, well, because they have a big following. Yeah, that's awesome. But like, why does the audience care? Like, what's the value that's really going to be bringing to them, and what are they going to learn from them? So those are the type of things that really align with like the mission value statements that our clients are trying to do when they launch a show.
Yeah. Speak a little bit to the point of solo podcasts versus interview style. Before I did podcasting, I had a radio show and a Facebook Live show, and it was always interview style. And I love, as part of this is the connection that I get to make with people, and I get to learn new things, new tools, tricks, and, just have that connection in this digital virtual world where I'm sitting in my house, with my dogs and not any coworkers. But I also really appreciate and listen to a lot of solo podcasters. So how do you decide which one? And I know there's some people who do a mix of them, but how do you decide what's the best strategy for your clients?
It really depends on who they want to do the solo hosting, to be honest, to be very clear. We're working on a show right now that is in the very beginning stages, and we're having this exact conversation. And where I'm landing is like, let's do both. Like, let's leverage the feed and do both. Like, let's do maybe 2 episodes a week that are going to be interview style. And then on every Friday morning, let's do a solo where the host is going to have a more an opinionated type of show. I think that's where the creativity needs to come in. Like, we automatically get conditioned when it comes to listening to audio that we need to be an interview style show, which I think brings a lot of value. You want to bring an expert in, or a client in, or a prospect in, who can show the audience or help them learn about something that they don't know. There's a lot of shows out there that provide that. But I think there's not enough, if I'm being candid, in the space of strong opinions being expressed from businesses. I think we see this a lot on individuals who are starting a show because they're very passionate about, I don't know, working out or something, right? Like, they will tell you, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that. But we don't get a lot of that from organizations, for the fear of the pushback, the fear of legality, the fear of, driving away a prospective client. I wish there was more of that in the space. And also just like keeping it shorter. Like, I obviously appreciate a good monologue as anybody else, but you can't have somebody going solo for more than, honestly, 15 minutes. I think unless they're media trained and they have, some sort of strong personality, like I had mentioned previously, or big following, I think keeping it to 5-ish minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, I think is a smart way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. I appreciate that. What is next for StudioPodMedia? So you went from studio, which you still have, to virtual, mostly working B2B, storytelling. Where do you see yourself going in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we're all podcast agencies or production companies. Everyone uses a different name these days. For us, what I can say is I want to continue to scale the business at a rate that makes sense for us. Being from Silicon Valley, I think you tend to get roped into, you need to raise a bunch of money and get these huge valuations. And that's not why I initially started the business. So for us, what I would like to do is I want to start working with more startups. We've had the luxury to work with Fortune, 500 brands and large organizations who have big names and big budgets. But part of the reason why I started the business was to lower the barrier of entry into podcasting. And I feel that it's not quite getting a race to zero quite yet, but I want to be able to create something that makes it easier for organizations at a smaller scale to get into the medium. And so that's what I think is immediately on my mind. And then the other thing is there opportunities to present ourselves as being the production arm for a larger organization? Yeah. And whether that means, an acquisition, a merger, or just some sort of exclusive partnership, I think that's really interesting to me as well, solely because I really do believe we're still very, very early in this. And I think we saw a moment with Salesforce. They started Salesforce Plus as an example, and they were creating this almost like media hub. And we're seeing a lot of organizations, and at SaaStr last year, there's a lot of talk around why marketing organizations need to build media hubs within their organization. And there's some cool companies out there like Audience Plus that are doing this. But I think it would be really interesting to build strong partnerships as being like the exclusive production partner for a SaaS organization out there, or a larger marketing agency who doesn't get into podcasting. I think, the build versus buy is great for tech companies, but buy versus build is a lot easier for agencies. So I'm keeping my eye on like what's going on out there. And I'm not saying that's my whole strategy here is to exit and move forward. I would love the idea of partnering and bringing lots of cool organizations together, creative organizations, thoughtful organizations together to create one really, really interesting content hub, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, TJ, where can people find you, and what are some of the things that they'll find when they go to your website, for instance?
Yeah, so people can find me on LinkedIn. It's TJ Bonaventura. It's a pretty easy name. Well, hard to spell, but it's phonetic. And I have our site, which is StudioPodMedia.com, which there you can see some of the clients we've worked with, some of the shows we've worked on, and some of the work that we've done. On LinkedIn, I'm pretty active in engaging with posts and creating my own posts and just creating thoughtful content that will hopefully be helpful. I feel like if more people are creating value on LinkedIn, especially when it comes to podcasting, more people will be interested, which I think is LinkedIn's in a very interesting place. So I think that's a good approach to take. So I would say come to our site, StudioPodMedia.com, or come follow me on LinkedIn, TJ Bonaventura.
Awesome. And then, I always like to ask, do you have a favorite quote, mantra, verse, family motto?
I do. And this is something that when we first started the studio, we had these really cool posters that were stitched up, and we put it like, it's the first thing you see when you walk up the stairs into the studio. And it's one by Winston Churchill. The quote goes, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." And that kind of aligns with our mantra of like, just because you have a lot of downloads, just because you're getting a lot of traction, just because you're not getting that mean you're doing well or not. It's the continuous effort to keep going. And I think it's something for me as a first-time entrepreneur. I always try to remind myself to continue on.
Awesome.
And we try to live by that creed as much as we can.
Fantastic. Funny story. That's something that's scheduled for my social media for next week. That same quote.
Really? No way. That's
yes,
crazy.
I was like, wait a minute.
I've heard that it might not have been Winston Churchill, but everywhere you look, it looks like he gets credited for it. So I'm going to go with it. It's an awesome quote. It means a lot to me, my business partner, and the rest of our organization. So I love it. Hope you see a lot of traction with it. People relate to it.
Yeah. Thank you. TJ, this is awesome. I really enjoyed hearing your story, your journey, and your advice. I think you have been definitely, dare I say, in the very early, almost grandparent days of podcasting for as young as you are. So really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, and we'll make sure to put your links in the show notes so that everybody can find out how to work for you. I think podcasting has to be part of your strategy from the get-go whenever you're starting a business these days. So definitely look to TJ and StudioPodMedia for your needs. And with that, thank you. And thank you to the audience for listening to another episode. I'll be back again in a few days with another expert guest. Want more? Check out amplifywithannika.com or follow me on socials at amplifywithannika.